email, DM, uh, text, if you can get their number, whatever it is, if you find a way to reach out to them, shoot them an email and just say, "Hey, I'm X. I'm a student at whatever, or I'm doing this. I'm really interested in the field that you're in. Do you have time for a coffee, or could we chat on the phone?" And I found my experience was that most times people will say yes, right? And you might have to follow up with them a couple of times.
For sure.
You might not get a response the first time. Very few people actually say no. And so it's worth it. If you send 10 emails and you get or 10 DMs and you get five, six, seven conversations out of it. Hell, even if you get one conversation out of it, it's really worthwhile. And for two reasons. The first is you get information that'll help you in that career. What should I do? Blah blah blah. And the second one is that you've established a relationship with someone. You can go back to them, you thank them afterwards, you keep them updated on what you're doing, you check in with them, you follow up, have follow up coffees. And this isn't a monthly thing, but it's something where you check in with them. Maybe it's once a year, maybe it ends up being every 2 years as you move on, but you maintain that relationship.
Welcome to Clay's Council, everyone. This is your host, Clay D, the one and only, and I'm joined here by the wonderful and talented Mr. Shane Greer. So, Mr. Shane, if you could just tell the audience, just some information about yourself, and we can keep the conversation going from there.
Yeah, sounds good. And Clay, thank you for inviting me on. So I am the co-owner and co-publisher of campaigns and elections. And when I get asked what campaigns and elections is, I always say, well, if you were an accountant and you got a subscription to Accountancy Today or Accountants Monthly, we're that kind of thing. We are a trade publication, but in our case, for the political campaign industry, principally in the United States and also in Latin America.
That's great. Now, Shane, your career trajectory is truly remarkable. Securing a C-level position at the age of 29. Can you share some key lessons or mindsets that enabled such early success?
Yeah, I think one of the things I always say to folks, I was speaking to a group of students I'm from Northern Ireland originally, and I was speaking to a
Yes.
group of students from the University of Ulster a couple of days ago, and they were asking me at the end for some career advice, and one of the things I always say, and I said to them, is never underestimate the likelihood that someone established, a leader in the field that you want to pursue, is willing to share their time with you if you ask them. I say to folks, when you're young and you're starting out and you want to go into anything, email, DM, text, if you can get their number, whatever it is, if you find a way to reach out to them, shoot them an email and just say, "Hey, I'm X. I'm a student at whatever, or I'm doing this. I'm really interested in the field that you're in. Do you have time for a coffee, or could we chat on the phone?" And I found my experience was that most times people will say yes, right? And you might have to follow up with them a couple of times.
For sure.
You might not get a response the first time. Very few people actually say no. And so it's worth it. If you send 10 emails and you get or 10 DMs and you get five, six, seven conversations out of it. Hell, even if you get one conversation out of it, it's really worthwhile. And for two reasons. The first is you get information that'll help you in that career. What should I do? Blah blah blah. And the second one is that you've established a relationship with someone. You can go back to them, you thank them afterwards, you keep them updated on what you're doing, you check in with them, you follow up, have follow up coffees. And this isn't a monthly thing, but it's something where you check in with them. Maybe it's once a year, maybe it ends up being every 2 years as you move on, but you maintain that relationship. And the one thing I always say to folks when you get those kind of meetings, the one question, there's a lot of questions you'd ask, and those questions will depend on the field that you're going into. But the one question you should always ask, regardless of what field you're going into, is who else should I chat to? And that opens the door for them to make introductions between you and people that they know, right? And if the conversation with them's gone well, they might be introducing you to a friend of theirs who works in a similar field, the same field or whatever. And then you're using them to expand your network. And that's so powerful because you're able to, at a very young age, start to establish a network of people who they know you, they like you, and because they've helped you, because they've shared their expertise, they're already in a little way invested in your success. Um, so that's so valuable. And the other thing I always say to people is, once you've got established, make sure you do the reverse, right? So when folks reach out to you and they're looking for advice, make the time to have that conversation, make the time to meet with them. If you can, make the time to make connections. I recently had a kid from Northern Ireland who was introduced to me who's looking to come and work in politics in the US, not necessarily in campaigns, more likely in the policy side. And I took I took 20 minutes and I made a bunch of email introductions to folks I know who work in the think tank world. I said, hey, listen, got into this kid. I think he's great. I'd love it. You could just share some of your experience with him. And then I put it over to them to do it. It's so valuable. So anyway, a short answer to a short question is always trust and believe that people are more likely to be helpful than not, and take that opportunity to reach out to folks for help, for advice.
That sounds like great advice, Shane. With your extensive experience in the publishing industry, how have you navigated the transition from print to digital, and what strategies have been proven to be most effective?
Yeah, so and this is an interesting one because in North America, campaigns and elections, we started in 1980 as a print
Yes.
magazine, and it was a print magazine up until early 2015. And when my business partner and I acquired C&E, we closed down the print magazine because it was a loss-making venture, and we pivoted totally digital. Down in in Mexico City, where the Latin American side of the business is based, we still have a print magazine there. It does really well, and so long as it continues to do really well, we'll have a print magazine there. So I don't sort of take the view that print is necessarily dead or dying. It is difficult to have a successful print publication today, but I think that the question you have to ask is a pretty binary one, which is this print publication contributing to our business or is it not? And I ask that question for a really simple reason. One of the challenges, in my experience, that publishing businesses have, if they have a print edition of anything, is every commercial decision gets made through the prism of we are a print publication. And when you have that mindset, it has you focusing on the wrong thing. I'm always mindful of one of the best business articles I ever read, which is from, I think it was a 1958 Harvard Business Review article called Marketing Myopia. And the
Nice.
article always says, the article says, ask yourself what you're in the business of doing, right? And a lot of folks will say, well, we're a newspaper publisher or a magazine publisher. No, that's not what you're in the business of doing. That's the means by which you conduct your business. You're in the business of putting out content, of educating an audience about, in our case, the political campaign industry, regulations, and so on. It just happened that for a couple of decades, the best way of doing that was by print. And so we did it by print, and that made us money. Nowadays in the US, for us, that isn't true. The best way to get that content out there is digital through our events. So we are the same business. It's just that the means by which we conduct our business are different.
That sounds like good advice. I definitely would like to check that article out myself. Now, Shane, you've mastered the art of business turnarounds and unlocking hidden profit opportunities. So what's your process for analyzing a company's strengths, weaknesses, and even untapped potential?
Yeah, so it obviously depends on the business. Where I would give you an example of where I started. So when back in 2012, my then business partner and I, we sold our UK business to another much larger business, and I joined them for a year. And I was tasked with a very specific mission, which was I was asked to turn around their publishing division. Um, and so where I started with that was essentially I spent a lot of time going through spreadsheets and talking to people because I wanted to understand what they thought made money in the division. And then I wanted to test their assumptions against the financials and say, okay, actually, is this what makes money? And I say that because, and this depends on the scale of a business, but in a business like that, you've got a lot of staff, and where you allocate them as a cost matters, right? And you say to me, well, I think that this publication or this entity is making money But then I look at it and I chat to people, I realize that actually you're telling me that person X and this team 20% of their time is going to this thing. Actually, I can see that it's closer to 45% of their time that's going to this thing, which means that that thing is at best a lot less profitable than you thought. And secondarily, that something else that you thought was less effective is maybe more effective. So I like to, I mean, different people take different approaches. I take a very analytic approach. I want to get into the numbers. I want to understand what the numbers represent. I want to understand what different people are doing. And then I like to pull it apart. And ultimately I like to ask the question, what is like the minimum viable product? What is the minimum number of people and resources that we would need to do exactly what we're doing right now? And ultimately, that's quite revealing. When you do that, it starts to reveal to you what isn't working, what is working. It doesn't mean that you cut back to that kind of bare bones thing, but it's the position from which you rebuild. You kind of rebuild from that kind of first principle. So that's kind of my approach. And again, that's kind of in a turnaround situation where you've got an entity, you've got data to go on, and you're able to dive into the numbers and say, oh, actually, you know what you think is happening here is not what's actually happening here.
So aligning paid and non-paid audiences with clients is crucial for native advertising success. How do you approach this challenge, and what tactics have you employed or deployed to create such scalable opportunities?
Yeah, so we kind of switched on to native advertising, and for folks who don't know, essentially it's sponsored content, right? It's an article
Yep.
that someone has paid for. We turned on to this a few years ago now, and I don't claim that we're anywhere close to being the best to do it for sure, but the approach we take is twofold. Number one, we are very clear about what content is sponsored. If you go to our website and you see an article, you will know immediately. The first thing you will know is that it's sponsored, and then you'll know what the article is. And that's because we don't want any trickery. We
Yep.
want our audience to know what someone is paying for them to see, and what someone isn't paying for them to see. The second thing, though, and that's how you not just build, but that's how you maintain trust with your audience. But the second piece is, how do you service that client who is paying? And ultimately, that comes down to working with them to understand something really fundamental. What is interesting to them is not necessarily what's going to be interesting to the reader. I've lost count of the times where someone is paying for something like this, and they send you over copy that reads like a press release, and there's just nothing interesting about it. And at that point, you have to have a conversation with them and say, explain this to me. Like, what is it you're doing here? And then we use our expertise to be able to say, well, actually, what's really interesting to our folks here is this. Let's dive into that a little bit more. And then we aim to help them craft a piece that is actually delivering information to our audience that they will find valuable, and doing it in a way that they will find interesting. So that ultimately, the ideal is that although it's a sponsored article, the reader is getting almost as much value, maybe sometimes even more value from it than they might from a non-sponsored piece, because you've taken the time to understand what the reader wants, what the sponsor's objective is, and you do it in a way that both are getting value. It's not always possible, don't get me wrong, but that's the kind of gold standard, and certainly that's the gold standard that we try to get to, and with clients where that's possible, that's always what we do.
Now, talking about building and bare bones, Shane, you just mentioned it right there. So building and leading effective teams are essential for any business leader. Speaking for yourself, what are your philosophies or principles when it comes to team management, as well as fostering a shared commitment to success?
Yeah, and that's a great question. We are very intentional
Yeah.
about that. Very, very intentional. And what does that translate to? I I will start with an anecdote as a foreigner in America. But I think it's an anecdote that speaks to a truth that is too wide here. The number of times I send an email to someone and I get an out of office reply from an American that is something to the effect of, and I'm exaggerating here, but I'm currently undergoing kidney surgery. I apologize that I am not checking my email every second of the day. But if you need me urgently, I have requested a local anesthetic so I can still speak to you. Here is my personal cell. That's a total exaggeration, but my point
Yeah.
is you get this sense of total fear, right? That they have to be connected 24 hours a day, that everything about themselves, their person, their family has to be in service to the job. Um, I hate that. It's total nonsense. If your employees are sending emails like that, you are a bad employer. And
Mm.
frankly, you're not getting as much out of your team as you could be. We are goal and work oriented, by which I mean, um, as long as the job is getting done when it needs to get done, we really don't care um, what times you're doing it or how you're doing it, as long as you're there for the essential meetings. Unless you've got a good reason not to be. And by the way, what's a good reason? I'll give you an example of this from the other day. In fact, no better. Let me give you an example of this from this morning.
Sure.
So this morning, we have a standing sales meeting on Thursday morning, followed by an all team operations meeting. And an operations meeting is when we review all of our upcoming events. We go through every action item for those events to make sure that everything is on track and so on. And one of the team slacked me this morning and said, "Do you mind? Could we move that meeting to Friday? My brother is just brother's wife just delivered her baby, and she wanted to drive up to New York to be there to meet her first nephew, right? Sure, like we can move that meeting to Friday, right? Like you getting to go and meet your first nephew for the first time is more important than us being on a call at 11 a.m. on Thursday. We could all do that call on a Friday. And if we could all do the call on Thursday and you could miss it this week and join us next time. So
Yeah.
flexibility is really, really key because stuff comes up in people's lives and you have to you have to be flexible for that. And it's not always like it's not always mission critical things. This isn't, by the way, about making sure that members of your team can go to doctor's appointment, right? Like, first of all, here's like, we don't have sick leave at CNE. And the reason for that is I found that very odd. The idea that you had a set number of days or periods of time when you were allowed to be sick in a year or have something come up is a bit of a nonsense, right? Like if you have a medical appointment in the morning, you don't need to take half a day off to do that. Like go to your medical appointment. I'll see you later when you get back from your medical appointment. It's not, you're
Yeah.
not, we don't need to account for that time as long as you're delivering the job. And I think when you give people that flexibility, they are able to deliver, and they deliver to a higher standard because they're not as stressed. They're not terrified, which so many, I think, American employees are, of
Yeah.
losing their job, losing their health care, losing everything that goes along with that. So our approach is kind of a very person-centered one, which sounds wishy-washy, but it's not, right? People are people. They have stuff in their personal lives that's important to them. In a sense, it doesn't really matter what that is. It's just that it's important to them, and you want to show as much flexibility as possible while still getting the job done. And as long as those things work, you're going to do really, really well. You're going to have a great organization with a great culture, and a lot of trust with your staff. I mean, here's a funny one. I'll give you an example of.
Sure.
Very few people stay with a company forever, right? Like we recognize that from the get-go. If a member of our team is thinking of moving on, I know for a fact, because this happens, they will bring this up with me and my other co-owner, April, and they'll say, "Hey, listen, I'm looking to move on. Can I have a chat about it?" And we'll have a chat with them, and we'll talk to them about it. We'll figure out where they want to move. We'll figure out what their kind of timeline is, and we'll see. Is there anyone in our sector that we could introduce them to that might help them make that transition? How can we help them, and so on. That does two things. One, we recognize that's a normal part of life. People get new jobs. Two, they know that they have people who are in their corner to help them make that kind of transition. So we take something that would otherwise be maybe stressful, and now it isn't. And three, we don't end up with someone saying, "Hey, I'm leaving in 2 weeks," because they've had this conversation with us a couple of months
Wow.
before. We know that they want to leave. We don't want to, that might give us an opportunity to say, "Hey, listen, we would really love to keep you. How do we make that happen?" It may be that what it is that they're looking for isn't something that we can facilitate. Maybe they're looking for upward movement that we can't provide, or a new type of experience that we don't have in house. And then we know that we're not going to be a good fit for one another. But then that gives us a couple of months to find a replacement and to help them find their next opportunity.
That's great. That's wonderful. More need to be like you.
Yeah.
Um, that are your employees, Shane, are they all local to DC? Are they remote? What does that mix look
I,
like?
Yeah, all over. So we used to be, and I mean, this is one of the things that came out of COVID, right? Like we used to be very DC centric, with only one employee based outside DC. Now we have folks all over the place. I mean, case in point, my business partner Shane April, he left the area. He moved down to Charleston. We have employees over in San Francisco and Los Angeles in New York. And also, we as I mentioned, we have our Latin American operation. So we got folks that are based down in Mexico City and Puebla. So people all over. Um, what we have found is that for us, it is important that we're on approximately the same kind of time zone, right? Like East Coast and West Coast works. I don't know that it would work for us to have someone on the US team who was based in Europe necessarily. Certainly for most of our roles, if it was maybe like on a tech development side, that might work. But yeah, no, we don't have an office anymore. Well, we do have an office in Mexico, but we don't have an office in DC. We got rid of that. We went fully remote, and we like it. And I think one thing that is helpful for us, because we do a lot of events through the year, we see the team at the events.
Yeah.
So we do still get that in person time. I mean, tonight, this. Well, I say
Yeah.
tonight. Obviously, it depends when someone is listening to this. But tonight, as I speak on April 24th, we have a party we're hosting in happy hour we're hosting in DC. Later, I'll see some of the team there. So we still have opportunities to get together. But yeah, we're mainly remote now.
That's great. That's great for sure. Yes, you all do put on a lot of great events throughout the year. I can
Thank you. I
certainly
appreciate
see
that.
that. Most definitely. And speaking of just, obviously, these events serve as a great ways for networking and everything, and even just business procurement acquisition. But just speaking on that, acquisitions and post-acquisition integration can be complex processes, excuse me. From your experience, what are the critical factors that ensure a smooth transition and successful integration?
Yeah, that is a tough one. And I say that because most in my, folks I know, myself as well, a lot of times acquisitions don't work out. And they don't work out because often there is the cultures don't mix, right? And culture in an organization is a thing that is slow to change. Sometimes you don't need to change it. But when you're bringing together two different organizations that inevitably have different cultures, how different those cultures are is going to have a big impact on how successful that integration will be. So if you have a really like the kind of culture we talked about a moment ago, where everyone's terrified and putting out of offices on that suggest they're afraid that they're going to be given the axe the next day, versus
Yeah.
another culture that's very different, that challenge, you really have to get into that process during your due diligence. Try and understand what the dynamic at a particular company is like, and ask yourself, okay, I can see that I can make the case for this on a spreadsheet. It's very easy to make a case for anything on a spreadsheet, right?
Yeah.
You're just putting numbers in. What is more difficult is to step back from that and sort of test it and go, okay, what problems do I see here? How would I solve those problems? Are those problems solvable? Testing that with people who know you, who know how you operate, and having a kitchen cabinet of folks around you who will give you not just their opinion, but an opinion that often will not be flattering to you, right? Like I always, I one of the good things about my business partner and other people in my circle who I call on for advice, it's not that they know what I'm good at. I like to think that I know what I'm good at, but they are uniquely aware of what I'm bad at. they're uniquely aware of where my weaknesses are, and they're able to say to me bluntly, like, listen, I don't think you could do this, and here's why. I think you would do a bad job at this. That's really, really helpful because it allows you to look at a situation kind of not impartially, but you look at it through fallible eyes and go, you know what, actually, yeah, I can see this being a problem. Now that's an overview. There's a lot that goes into an acquisition. There's a lot that goes into a merger, and it depends on what you're merging and what you're buying and all of that. But culture is so often the biggest problem. I think the thing you have to bear in mind again is that it's easy to put numbers on a spreadsheet. It's easy to say to yourself that you're going to save more money than you thought you were going to save, that you're going to drive more revenue than that, blah, blah, blah. Try and dial those numbers back a little bit, and you'll maybe end up something that looks a bit more like reality. And then think about whether the cultural integration will actually work.
Great, great tips there, Shane. Now, Shane, as an influential figure in the publishing world, what trends or disruptions do you foresee in the industry, and how can businesses stay ahead of the curve? Now, obviously, you had the conference last week, and just curious to know what trends or disruptions do you forecast in the political campaign industry or even the public policy sector and such, and how can basically these consultant firms
Yeah.
and all of that, and even what you do and the work you do, like the work that campaign selections can do to stay ahead of the curve?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that we could unpack there. So I think I'll pick out
Sure.
the biggest kind of uncertainty, not just for our sector, but for loads of sectors, which is artificial intelligence and specifically generative AI. Um, it's going to have, and already is having, radical impacts in the political campaigning world, both positive and negative, and in both cases unknown, right? So folks that are using artificial intelligence to draft more effective fundraising emails, you could see that as a positive. But we can also look at things like deep fakes, and I'm sure we all remember the audio fake of Biden in New Hampshire that was used to try and drive down turnout for the Biden campaign. So we can see positives and negatives in both directions, and we're really at the earliest stages of generative AI transforming how we work, and we don't know what the other side's going to look like. There's a lot of jobs that are going to get created. There's a lot of jobs that are probably going to get destroyed. The way we use our time is going to change. And so it's a big unknown that we all have to wrestle with. How does that apply to publishing? I mean, one of the ways that it applies to publishing is, right now, folks are used to going to Google or whatever their search engine of choice is, and they search for a
Yeah.
topic, and they see articles come up, and they click through to it, and maybe it's a New York Times, maybe it's campaigns and elections, whatever it is. Well, in that world, traffic goes to your site to read your article that you've produced. When those search engines, as they already are, start transitioning to a more generative AI approach, where you ask it a question and it answers it, it's presenting you with an amalgam of information that it's pulled from a lot of different sources to answer your question. But you're not going to the site so that system is then using our content to answer questions that people have. Now, a lot of people in the publishing industry at the moment are saying, well, this is a misuse of our content. I don't know that it is or it isn't. I mean, I certainly can see the same challenges that other publishers do. I take a more agnostic view generally, which is, rather than staking out a position in this, I'm just going to see how it emerges, and we're going to have to react to that, right? Where maybe the future is one in which people are more likely to be asking questions through a channel. Like we can provide very niche information that will help folks in this sector. So maybe what publishing looks like in the future is quite different. Rather than reading articles, people will maybe want to ask questions and have those questions answered. And maybe that's something that we have to position ourselves to do. I don't have an answer on how to do that yet. I think it's just about being aware of what that change will mean. But it is going to be a fundamental. It is going to be a fundamental change. I mean, I think of one really minor example that is going to affect us all. But you could apply this principle to so many other things. We are not many iterations of AI away from. I'll give you an example, right? We have this. We're doing this podcast now, and for folks who are listening, I have to say that Clay was really gracious in accepting my apology at the beginning before we started recording because I was a little bit late. Why was I late? Well, it's because I had a meeting beforehand. I'm down in Georgetown in DC, and I wanted to find a quiet spot in a cafe to record this interview, and I could not find a cafe close enough. That's on me. So we're now sitting here, we're doing this interview and so on. But we're not many iterations of AI going ahead where I'll say to AI, put this meeting on my calendar, put this podcast on my calendar. I'm meeting this person at cafe, whatever first. And then I need another cafe to record this podcast at this time. And it just goes off and does all of that. It books me a table at one, it books me a table at the other. I have a walking route ready for me. All of that stuff takes place. That is labor that we all have to do ourselves now, right? We're pretty close to a world where AI can do those kind of things. Well, you apply that to any number of sectors. To send me send me the Zoom link for this interview, you had to create the meeting in Zoom, and you had to send me the link, and you had to physically do that. We're not many iterations away from you saying to your personal assistant AI, do this thing, and it goes and does that thing. That's transformative. So anyway, I've been kind of vague. I apologize for that, but I'm vague because we're dealing with an unknown, and we all just have to watch how that unknown is developing, and then be ready to operate in that new world that currently we don't know how to navigate. No pressure.
Absolutely. Now, just you're a business owner and an entrepreneur. What are some of the most significant obstacles you faced, and how have you overcome them?
Yeah. Wow. Let me give you.
Sure.
Let me give you two
Any answer is good.
examples. I'm going to give you two answers. The first is a personal obstacle, and then the second is more of an operational or environmental obstacle. So the personal obstacle was like anyone else who starts out doing anything, doesn't matter what it is. I didn't know how to do it when I was beginning, and I had a lot of weaknesses. One of my weaknesses early on, and I know this is true for a lot of entrepreneurs, managers, uh, moms and dads. It's true for a lot of people. Delegating. People are terrible at delegating. I was terrible at delegating, and I was terrible at delegating. Um, if I'm honest, because I just always felt if I did it, I know it would get done the way I wanted it to get done, and I felt like the way I was going to do it was better. And maybe there's a degree of vanity or hubris in that. But even if that was right at times, it took me a while to learn that I would multiply. Like there was kind of a force multiplier in handing stuff off to other people when I could. And that was true even if they did something in a way that I wouldn't have done it, or they did something to a level of quality that I felt was lower than would have been the case if I had done it. And that's simply because that was something that then I wasn't having to do. Right. So that's time that I got back. So that was a big problem to overcome. And it really took me a long time to figure it out. And the one thing I would say is it wasn't something that I figured out on my own. I mean, this was something that peers who I respected had observed this problem. Like, why are you doing that? Like, well, you shouldn't be doing that. You should have someone else do this. And it took me a while to get over that kind of difficulty, to start to trust other people, to start to trust my own ability to decide what should be delegated. So that's number one. The other one is environmental, and I think like a lot of business owners, I'm going to point to COVID. And especially as a business owner of a business that does a lot of live events, right? Like we hosted our last event in 2020 in late February. It was the Reed Awards in Atlanta. We had hundreds of people there. We're all, celebrating the best work in the campaign industry. And we were all talking about COVID. We were all talking about it. It wasn't, it was in the US, but we were still 4 weeks or something away from our world shutting down. But when that happened, we suddenly had to navigate an environment in which a lot of our business just evaporated overnight, right? We couldn't host live events. We weren't selling tickets. We weren't selling event sponsorships, and so on. And I spoke to a lot of other publishers, media owners, event operators, and I noticed that they were all trying to it's a difficult thing to frame, but essentially they were all trying to plug holes. They were all running from a position of panic. Like, how do we preserve what we have? How do we keep as much of the sponsorship? This is this event that we were going to host in June that's now going to have to be canceled. How do we retain as much of that sponsorship, even though we don't know when that event is going to be or if it'll ever be? And that I found to be a very kind of negative mindset to be bringing to it. So what April and I did was we sat down one day and we recognized two things. One was that maybe the business wouldn't survive COVID, right? Maybe this was something that could destroy the business. And two, we started from the assumption of let's assume that this isn't going to end. Let's assume that this is the new normal, right? And that events are not going to be an option for us ever again. Mm-hmm. What would we do? What is this business at that point? And by taking that mindset, we immediately had to discount a lot of stuff. We had to ignore a lot of stuff. We forgot. And what we did was we decided that, you know what, people aren't going to pay to go to virtual events. They're not that interesting. But what about if we created virtual events that were only accessible to our members? We didn't have members. But what about if we created a paid membership scheme and access to our virtual events is one of the perks of membership? We did that, and that just took off like a rocket. Like, we had to hire someone as a full-time community manager in the first 2 months. And that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't started from the premise that this is the new normal. We are never going back to live events. Now, obviously, we hope that we would go back to live events. But what that meant was that we focused on building something that was independent of the existence of live events and, crucially, would continue to be an item of business that we would have after live events came back. And that's very different than what a lot of other small B2B publishers did, which was they pivoted to do things like webinars and stuff like that, which are great. But people don't want to do as many webinars when you get back to live events. So you've brought a whole bunch of revenue in during COVID, but it's not necessarily revenue that you kept post-COVID. Whereas our membership is something that not only did we keep through COVID, we grew through COVID, and it continues to grow. And now it's a big contributor to the business, while we also got all of our event stuff back. So those were my two big kind of challenging moments where we were able to make some changes and meet the challenge.
That's great. Those are all good tidbits there that you provided, Shane. Now, if you could just tell folks, since we're kind of running low on time here, how can folks follow you, get in touch with you, stay on top of you, what you're doing currently with campaigns, elections, and everything else you have going on?
Yeah, sure. So the first one is, if you're interested in the campaign industry, and you might not be, but if you are, go to campaignsandelections.com, campaignsandelections.com. You can subscribe to CNE there. You can read our editorial content there. You can find out about our events and so on. So please do that. And also go to, you can follow us you can find our social links there. So follow those as well. I also invite you, equally, if you're interested in campaigns, but also if you're not, come and add me, follow me on LinkedIn. I'm not on other social media. I'm primarily on LinkedIn. So come to LinkedIn. I'm just LinkedIn/Shane Greer, I think but you can find me. I look like this. This is the podcast, so you don't know what I look like, but Google Shane Greer LinkedIn, and I'll come up. So follow me there. I try and post a lot about the industry, but also about business in general, and sort of life lessons that it sounds a bit corny, but stuff that I've kind of worked through that I think other people might find helpful. I'd love to connect with you there.
That's good. Well, thank you again, Shane, for being here. And folks, thank you for tuning in to Clay's Counsel. Be sure to like and subscribe to our page, Lorraine and moi, and stay tuned for more content.